I start the webinar and the production start the music. So, Beltrán, estás por ahí, ¿no?
Todo preparado.
Ok, pues empezamos.
Welcome to session 6, in which we will launch the WBU Employment Survey and share our results with you. I am Karen Wolf from the United States, the panel facilitator, and I would like to extend my thanks to the World Blind Union and ONSE for their efforts in making the World Blind Summit available and supporting our efforts. I'd also like to thank the WBU Employment Committee with whom I work. Angela Hartley, Matt Wiesler, Ron Houghton, Shalika Karanarati. Sorry, I always mess up your last name, Shalika. Chanyao Chong, Mitch Pomerantz, Martin O'Kane, Barbara Martin Munoz, Vibhu Sharma, and Mohammed Iqbal. I will share as briefly as possible highlights of the WBU Employment Survey results, and then introduce our panelists. Martin O'Kane from Northern Ireland, Jerry Coons from the United States, and Chanyao Chong from Asia. They will tell you a wee bit more about themselves. They will also provide you with their perspectives of the survey based on the geographic area in which they live, and also present considerations for employment of people with visual impairments moving forward. Each panelist will chat with you for approximately 15 minutes, and then we will open the discussion to hear from you. Please hold your questions until all 3 panelists have presented. You may either raise your virtual hand or write your question in the chat. And Ellen Najjar from the United States, who is helping me with logistics today, will read the chat questions to the panelists you indicate in the order they are received. If you raise your virtual hand, I will call on you myself, hopefully, if I see your hand. Thank you in advance for reserving your questions and comments until the end of the panel discussion. Well before the pandemic, in preparation for the WBU General Assembly planned for Madrid in summer 2020, the WBU Employment Committee launched an online employment survey in English, Spanish, and French. If potential respondents were unable to access an online survey, we made the tool available in a printable file, and service providers with access to the internet inputted the respondents' answers. We closed the site to begin our analyses in May 2020. And today we'll share with you results from both quantitative and qualitative information received from the respondents. We received 2,428 responses from respondents in 85 countries. We analyzed data from all respondents and have all the descriptive and comparative analyses in the final report, which was published for WBU by National Industries for the Blind in the United States. You may request the full report from Ellen or me. Our emails are in the chat. We analyzed the data we received from all respondents, and I will report on those results today. However, because the number of responses varied widely by country, we also broke the data into chunks for detailed analyses by country based on the number of responses received. Results from Tier 1 countries, which included Australia, Canada, Spain, and the United States, accounted for 74% of our responses. The report, the full report, includes descriptive and comparative analyses for each of these 4 countries. However, only descriptive data are reported for Tier 2 countries and territory. Included were Germany, France, India, Hong Kong, Argentina, Great Britain, Ireland, and Sri Lanka, which accounted for 17% of responses. And Tier 3 countries, which included South Africa, Norway, the Philippines, New Zealand, Taiwan, Iceland, Pakistan, and Sweden, which accounted for 4% of the responses. The remaining 5% of the sample was drawn from 66 countries whose response rates ranged from 1 to 7 persons, and they are only included in the overall responses. What we learned was that due to the skewed nature of the responses, we received such a low number of responses outside the first tier of countries. It seemed at first glance as if the employment rates were higher in the second and third tier countries. What we suspect is that we were not able to reach unemployed individuals in these countries, that the majority of respondents to our survey, particularly from Tier 2, Tier 3, and those sorted 66 countries with just 5% of the responses, was that the majority of our respondents were employed people with connections to agencies, organizations, and NGOs from whom we gathered data. In other words, our survey respondents were likely not representative of all adults with blindness or low vision worldwide. Our respondents were better educated, had access to the internet, and devices that helped them to take the survey online, and were eager to share their employment experiences. What the sample really seems to represent are primarily employed people with visual disabilities globally, or those recently unemployed. In the group of long-term unemployed respondents, we found a significant number of individuals who had retired from work in our sample. The only segment that approximates a representative sample of the larger population of blind and low vision people is the segment looking at Tier 1 countries, where there were a sufficient number of people and responses to probe into differences and similarities between groups with some confidence. So today, as I mentioned, I'm only going to share with you those results from all respondents as a whole. And those key quantitative results follow. Most of our respondents, almost 85%, were between the ages of 25 and 64 years of age. And just over half, 52%, were women. The majority, 64%, were well educated, some college through postgraduate studies. Most respondents, 67%, lived in cities and were married, 45%, or single, 41%. Over half, almost 57%, were born with their visual impairments, and most considered the impairment either moderate, 32%, or significant, 31%. And just over a quarter of the respondents, 26.4%, were totally blind. Almost 3/4, 73.5%, reported no additional disabilities. 62% of the respondents overall were employed at the time of the survey. 93% of our respondents indicated that they had worked at some point in their adult lives. For those currently working, 70% reported above average or excellent job satisfaction. And over half, 52%, indicated that they had received promotions in their current jobs. Almost 2/3 of the currently employed respondents, 64%, reported that they worked 31 to 40 or 40 plus hours a week. 31% of those not working currently indicated that they had worked within the last 2 years and were considered as short-term unemployed. The remaining 69% of unemployed respondents were considered long-term unemployed. The respondents' preferred reading medium was electronic. 60% of our respondents chose electronic media as preferred. However, 35% of our respondents said they used Braille. And of those Braille users, 57% reported using Braille every day. The 10 most popular tools used by our respondents, and I'll give you their percentages following each device, were a smartphone, 81%, white cane, 53%, computer with screen magnification, 47%, other talking products such as kitchen timers, 45%, a large monitor, 40%, a computer with speech output, 39%, a tablet, 33%, an audio book player, 32%, reader apps, 30%, and low-tech devices such as handheld magnifiers were reported to be in use by 25% of our respondents. Let me share with you now some of the qualitative results. What our respondents liked best about their jobs, in descending order based on the number of instances they were mentioned, were number one, the people. Their co-workers, employers, customers, clients, students, the team. It was all about people. Number two, the salary, or simply stated, I liked being paid. Number three, accommodations so that a worker with a vision impairment can be productive. Number four, respect, fulfillment, being treated as an equal and receiving positive regard from others, making a contribution. Number five was flexibility, most often identified by those working remotely or by those who had chosen self-employment and could have a flexible schedule. And then last but not least, the intellectual challenge of work, which was sometimes stated as just liking the possibilities for learning, lifelong learning. What the respondents disliked most about their jobs, number one, transportation hassles. Over and over, we heard from people, it was a hassle to get to work. Even if they were employed, it took too long. It was burdensome. Number two, the inaccessibility of the work environment. Sometimes it was difficult for people to get the tools they needed in a timely fashion in order to be working competitively. The third issue that our respondents mentioned, technology. All technology, hardware, software, the issues were huge and they were ongoing. And for many people, it was those technology issues that drove them ultimately from the workplace. The fourth issue mentioned by many, many people was paperwork and handwritten forms, and that inaccessibility made their jobs very, very difficult at times, sometimes impossible. They had to bring in sighted assistants in order to access some of the paperwork. The fifth complaint was the inadequate or low salary that many of our employees mentioned. While they liked gaining a salary, they didn't always feel as if their salary was comparable to their sighted coworkers. The next one mentioned was in people's attitudes towards someone with a vision loss. And this was twofold. It was both employers and managers, and it was sometimes just the public, that people simply did not know and appreciate them as functioning human beings. Sometimes they underestimated their abilities, and that frustration bled through in their responses to us. The next problem mentioned was struggles with adapting to the work environment and duties. And this was often mentioned, to be very frank with you, by people who were adventitiously blinded, who simply felt that they could not reacclimate in the environment without vision. And then the last complaint, which is typical of all people, I think, in work, was that our respondents moaned about the bureaucracy and the meetings, the never-ending, seemingly never-ending meetings that they had to attend, often complicated because of inaccessibility of the devices that people were using in presentations that they made to them. In addition to gathering data and reporting these descriptive results, we also performed a series of comparative analyses to determine differences and similarities between employed short-term and long-term unemployed respondents. What we learned from our respondents, I'm just going to reset my clock here, hopefully. Ellen, you may have to monitor my time on this one. What we learned from our respondents, from those who were currently employed, was that most of them lived in cities, 70%. And again, we're 25 to 44 or 45 to 64 years old, 45 to 46% respectively. 53% had undergraduate or postgraduate degrees. The majority, 60%, were congenitally impaired, with moderate 33%, significant 28.9%, or total vision loss 28.6%. And they had no additional disabilities, 80% of our employed respondents. 83% of these workers used smartphones, 53% used computers with speech output, 52% used white canes, 47% used other talking products, and then 37% used computers with screen magnification, and 36% used large monitors. Although our currently employed respondents preferred electronic formats for reading, 63.5%, many were also Braille readers, 38.5%. The Braille readers, 512 people, tended to use Braille every day, 58% of those folks. 52% of the workers had worked first between the ages of 18 and 25. 34% had worked before the age of 18. Likewise, most of these workers had worked more than 10 years with their current level of vision, 48%. We learned that short-term unemployed respondents were just as likely as currently employed to live in cities, 68%. It was the long-term unemployed respondents who differed slightly. Only 61% of those respondents lived in cities, and 8% lived in rural areas, which was very different to the currently employed, 3% of whom lived in rural areas, and 4% of those short-term unemployed living in rural areas. That was a big difference in our populations. Likewise, it was the long-term unemployed respondents who differed most in terms of age. 61.5% were 45 to 64 years old, and 13% were over 65 years old. Compared to those short-term unemployed, 47% of whom were 45 to 64, and only 7.5% were over 65 years old. Differences were also apparent in education. Short-term unemployed reported comparable levels of education to those currently employed. It was the long-term unemployed in this sample who differed significantly. 21.5% were high school graduates, and 5% had less than high school compared to the currently employed. 13% were high school graduates, and 3.5% had less than high school. Short-term unemployed, 17.5% were high school graduates, and 2.4% had less than high school. This pattern held true when comparing undergraduate, postgraduate educational credentials as well. Currently employed, 53%, short-term unemployed, 44%, and long-term unemployed, 39%. The severity of respondents' vision losses was comparable across all three groups. However, there were differences in the groups regarding onset of visual disabilities and the presence of additional disabilities. The currently employed and short-term unemployed groups tended to be congenitally impaired, 59.5% and 59% respectively, while the long-term unemployed were less likely to be congenitally impaired, 47%, and far more likely to have lost vision between 18 and 55 years of age, compared to the currently employed and short-term unemployed. The presence of additional disability was far more prevalent in the long-term unemployed as well, 35% versus currently employed at 20% and short-term unemployed at 29%. Tool usage also differed considerably by employment status. For example, while 83% of employed respondents reported the use of smartphones, usage dropped to 77% for short-term unemployed and to 73% for long-term unemployed. Other major differences in tool usage are noted in the published report. 70% of the employed respondents described their satisfaction with their current jobs as above average, 39%, or excellent, 31%. 52% of these workers indicated that they had received promotions in their current jobs. By comparison, we asked short-term respondents the same question about job satisfaction and job promotions in their most current job. 31% of the short-term unemployed respondents rated their satisfaction as excellent, and 28% as above average. The greatest difference was related to promotions, and 82% indicated that they had not received promotions. The majority of currently employed respondents, 64%, were working 31 to 40 plus hours a week. By comparison, just over half, 53% of the short-term unemployed worked comparable hours, 31 plus hours at their most recent jobs. The short-term unemployed respondents were twice as likely to report 10 or fewer hours worked, 15%, versus those currently employed at 8%. Finally, we asked both short-term and long-term unemployed respondents whether they were actively seeking work, and their responses were starkly different. 58% of the short-term unemployed respondents indicated they were actively looking for work, while only 22% of the long-term unemployed were doing so. When asked if they were available to take a job immediately, 73% of the short-term unemployed versus 46% of the long-term unemployed responded positively. Likewise, when asked if they were interested in taking a job, even if not available immediately, 81% of short-term unemployed versus 60% of long-term unemployed responded positively. The most important messages for people with vision loss and the service providers working with them is that education matters. Access to electronic media is critical, and acquisition of basic blindness-specific skills, Braille, use of the white cane, tactile and auditory adaptations to the environment, etc., and interpersonal skills are extremely likely to lead to successful employment. Thank you very much for your attention. If you would like the full report, please let us know via email. Today's panelists will stimulate your thinking about next steps in our mutual campaign to improve the employment of people with visual impairments. Please join me in welcoming first Martin O'Kane. Martin, you have the floor.
Thank you, Karen. Hi, everyone, and my name is Martin O'Kane, and I am the strategic lead for employment for the RNIB, which stands for the Royal National Institute of Blind People. And RNIB is a leading UK charity which supports people with sight loss in the UK in every aspect of their lives, including employment. I am also the representative for Europe on the World Blind Union Committee, and today I'm going to share with you some of the responses from the World Blind Union survey provided by those European participants who took part in the survey. I'm going to briefly explore some of the learning points from those responses and what action needs to be taken to improve the situation for employment. So my first learning point from the survey is that a high proportion of those European respondents who reported that they had worked also lived in cities. Now, this could suggest that employment outcomes for people with sight loss can be linked to more urban locations as opposed to more rural geographical settings. There are a number of factors to consider here. There are likely to be more job opportunities available in towns and cities. and a better infrastructure in place for public transport to enable people with sight loss to move around independently. Other support services such as rehabilitation support and employment programs to help people to look for work may be easier to access in more populated and urban locations. So we need to consider the fact that for someone with sight loss who lives in a more rural location, this can present as an additional barrier to finding employment. Services that support people with sight loss to become more independent and to find employment need to be aware of how they are supporting their harder to reach customers who do not live in towns and cities, and to ensure that they provide channels for these customers to link in to vital services that they require. The change in working practices due to the pandemic has enabled many more people to work remotely and not necessarily having to be office-based. This new culture of remote working could provide greater opportunities for people with sight loss, as job opportunities become less focused on a location and more focused on the skills of the individual to do the job. My second learning point from the survey is that there is less diversity in careers evidenced from the participants in the survey from Europe in comparison to their US and Australian counterparts. In fact, there are some areas of work which did not feature at all in any of the respondents' answers. For example, no European respondents reported to having worked in areas such as architecture, engineering, maintenance, or construction. This response prompts us to explore why some countries have more diverse workforces in their blind and partially sighted population than others. Reasons for this could be that there are more employment opportunities available in certain parts of the world, and that it is easier for adjustments to be made to job roles in certain sectors. And some work sectors continue to find it challenging to employ people with sight loss. A third factor to consider is that careers guidance mechanisms in place for school leavers varies greatly across different countries. And this support at school age for young people with sight loss can impact greatly on their outlook and perception of the world of work when they are older. We should also appreciate the large part that support organizations play in helping people to find work. Where there are good structures in place to help people to prepare for employment and to search for work, there are much greater job outcomes for blind and partially sighted people. My third point from the survey I'd like to explore is that long-term unemployment respondents were most likely to report their educational achievement as being less than high school level. Now, this would show that there is a clear link between low educational achievements and low employment outcomes for blind and partially sighted people. There needs to be a greater focus on the support that young people with sight loss in school and further educational settings are receiving to enhance their chances of long-term employment. We need to call on educational providers to ensure that school environments are accessible for learners with sight loss. School curriculums need to be designed with consideration given to learners with sight loss. And those professionals who work in the education sector need to have access to training and support from specialist organizations to ensure that they are able to provide the same high level of teaching and support to their blind and partially sighted students as they do for their fully sighted learners. It is not acceptable that young people with sight loss are prevented from reaching their full educational potential due to their sight loss. And my last and final point from the survey that I'd like to share with you is around technology. Smartphones were used by 74% of employed respondents in the survey, and most respondents chose electronic formats as their preferred reading medium. Now we can see from this response just how important technology is, and this forms a huge part of people's lives, and this includes employment. There is such a wide range of hardware and software available now to enable people with sight loss to work. And this includes personal devices such as smartphones, which now have built-in accessibility features. Smart technology has meant that more and more people with sight loss can bring their own solutions to the workplace when faced with barriers around accessibility. Access to information is becoming much easier for people with sight loss, provided that they have the technology which enables them to do this. Technology has made employment a much more realistic option for people with sight loss, and many more jobs can now be adjusted using the right piece of technology. We need to get the message across to employers that people with sight loss can use technology to access information, and that more and more are doing this through their own remote smart devices.
Excuse me, Martin, 5 minutes.
Sorry?
I just wanted to warn you, 5-minute call.
Okay, thank you. Nearly finished, Karen. So this is something that needs to be promoted to employers who are hiring new staff, and to ensure that existing staff with sight loss stay in work with the correct adjustments. So to conclude, we can see from the responses of the European participants in the survey that there are some key themes emerging which need to be considered when looking at improving the situation for people with sight loss in employment. Firstly, access to public transport, employment programs, and support services do make it easier for people to find work. Secondly, there are still work sectors that do not recruit people with sight loss. This requires educating employers around adjustments and supporting people to try out more varied work choices. Thirdly, there is a direct link between low educational achievement and low job outcomes. And finally, technology is a key element to accessing information and opening up many more job opportunities for people with sight loss. I'd like to thank you for your time today and for listening to my presentation.
Thank you so much, Martin. I think that there will be some questions for you, which we will catch at the end, but you gave us a wonderfully concise and good overview of what's going on with our respondents in Europe. I appreciate that. Now I'd like to change gears or shift gears and go to my colleague in the United States, Jerry Coons. So Jerry, you have the floor.
Thank you, Karen, and it's a pleasure to be with you all. I've been in the employment of blind people field in one aspect or another since the mid-1960s. I am retired now, but I still stay involved in many programs that affect education and employment of blind visually impaired people. The effects of the survey really lead me to understand that we really have an extraordinarily small sample of people who have responded to what they do and how they do it. In North America, in primarily Canada and the United States, we had over 800, almost 900 respondents. That's like less than 1% of employed blind, visually impaired people in North America. Some of the information I took away from the survey results is very similar to what Martin has reported in Europe, although the outcomes have been more varied in terms of employment opportunities and employment titles. In North America, blind people who are more highly academically educated appear from our survey results to be more employed. There's a higher rate of employment among higher educated people. Employment requiring access to electronic information is prevalent. I was involved in the mid-1970s in facilitating how blind and visually impaired people could begin to have access to electronic information through an organization called Sensory Access Foundation. Our mission was to explore employment education needs using technology. We were very involved with many of the adaptive technology companies in defining what information technology would become necessary for blind people in employment and education. In understanding that, I was not, well, I'll say it differently. I was surprised to find that information access technology ended up leading most employees to having occupations. I anticipated it would make a big difference, but finding that information access technology is used by the overwhelming number of people doing work has led me to understand that we don't emphasize work in the trades, in the crafts, in the arts, and manual skills. We have underemphasized that for many years now with the advent of information technology. I think that was born to be true with our employment survey results, but I think we're overlooking the opportunities of blind people having opportunities to work without either academic skills or by not engaging them in the trades, in the crafts, in the arts, and developing manual skills. Resources are grossly underemphasized, underavailable in manual arts training. That's something that I'm very curious about and very interested in promoting. Young people in the United States are given very broad academic education, and they're integrated into the school system usually throughout their local communities, both in rural and in urban settings. However, academic training is the primary emphasis. Rarely do we find children in wood shops, in auto shops, in ceramics studios, or art training programs. It's mostly academic oriented training. And since we've gotten away from manual skills, I think we are missing great opportunities for increasing employment opportunities for blind and visually impaired people. In rural settings particularly, there would be many more opportunities to be employed with manual skills. But in our rural settings, the principal barriers to employment are clearly a lack of skill training opportunities and a lack of supportive services. Certainly transportation is one of them, but there are many jobs locally that could be done by blind, visually impaired people if we had the opportunity to develop our skill sets more broadly. I find that the employment survey does not necessarily represent the broad base of employed blind people in the United States. One of the things that has come to my awareness is that only, and this was true in the 1960s when I was a rehabilitation counselor and still true today, only about 30 to 35% of eligible employees who are blind and visually impaired are employed. That number to me remains remarkably low, even though we have so many advantages with technology, even though we have so many more opportunities for training, even though our education system is so much more allowing integration into the education system throughout our local communities. We have reduced the number of blind schools in the United States by over 50% in the last 50 years. And I understand the benefits of that, but also I am somewhat disappointed because at least at blind schools in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and certainly before, there was a lot more emphasis in manual arts and tool skill management and training than there is today. In conclusion, because I hope that we can generate a lot more questions to guide our responses, I would say that of the employed totally blind people in the United States, based on information from the American Foundation for the Blind, which was replicated first, I guess, initiated in the 1950s, but replicated in the 1990s. Of totally blind people, nearly 90% are Braille readers. With the advent of speech technology, text-to-speech technology, and audio recordings, even though many of us are good listeners and learning listeners, the majority of totally blind people are still Braille readers. When we remarked in the survey about electronic media as being the preferred access, we did not define clearly whether that was in large print, speech, or Braille. And I am curious about following up on those points if we ever do another survey. Yes, electronic media is many of our preferred modes as opposed to print or hard copy Braille.
Excuse
So
me,
once
Jim,
again,
5 minutes.
thank you. Once again, I believe that employment opportunities could be broadened greatly. And maybe a lot of people are doing things that we don't know about. So if we have the opportunity to explore the topic in a broader capacity, I would hope that we could get, instead of 2,500, 25,000 representative people in employment. Thank you for the opportunity to speak, and I'll look forward to questions.
Thank you, Jerry. I think you have stimulated our thinking in a very good way, particularly with regard to those manual skills that you mentioned. I appreciate that, and I'm sure our audience appreciates your insights there. I would like to now shift gears to Hong Kong and ask Chan Yao to please, well, Chan Yao, first I must ask you to change your phone again, because now you are horizontal, but your picture is vertical. So do you mind turning?
Oh, really?
This is what I love about doing these kinds of, there you are, straightened out. Technology gone amok. That's what we had there for a moment.
Okay.
Chan Yao,
Well,
thank you very much. You now have the floor.
Well, thank you, Karen, for reminding me that people need to see other people before listening. And now you see me properly. That's good.
Yes, I can listen.
Thank you. Well, thank you for organizing this panel, Karen, and thank you to Enclave for organizing this wonderful seminar. There are two things important to this. Number one is that we are being able to take part in a virtual summit, although we are sort of prevented from meeting each other face to face, closer, touching. And secondly, because World Blind Union conference used to be dominated by business, and we have requested that thematic discussions be more prominent, and it has now been listened to. And employment was a particular theme that we recommended from our committee, and is now being recognized. So thank you very much. And I also take this opportunity to congratulate Spain for going through in the European football last night. I was listening to it through the audio descriptive service of the Hong Kong Blind Union. I'm the president of the Hong Kong Blind Union, and this is a new service that we launched. And I'm looking forward to England versus Germany after this seminar, so don't be too long. I will reflect on several points from the survey from this region's perspective, the Asia Pacific region. Because of the language issue, not many people in this region were included in the survey. So therefore, an absence of some particular occupational situation in Asia was part of the limitation of the survey. So it is also a reason for doing another one, though. So for example, massage, which is a dominating profession in Asia, is not reflected. Particularly during the time of the virus, the coronavirus, where most of the masseurs were not being able to practice. And if they did, it was in limited, very limited window. So we are looking for a recovery, which is coming up, I hope. And that is a lesson. Perhaps the survey wasn't by its nature, wasn't able to reflect, which is the vulnerability of employment and the diversity which is needed in employment opportunities for the visually impaired. Okay, so we used to be challenging employers and the public alike about trying to link a particular job to visual impairment. Oh, you must be good for music and so on. We all know that. So, but in reality, it is still the situation. Okay, so diversity is not sufficient and is not reflected in the actual workplace, I think. The second point I want to discuss is, again, technology. I'm surprised that only 75% or 74% of the people mention smartphone as the primary most important technology. I would have thought it to be over 90%. There must be some bias or some interesting observations, but it is in a way against my common sense assumption. So technology has always been a double word for people with visual impairment. As Jerry mentioned, he mentioned sensational technology. That reminds me of the speech card that we used to work with Apple II computers some 40 years ago. So we were very optimistic at that time that information technology was able to create more jobs, and it did. And it fortunately, it was developed in such a way where accessibility was protected through the work of the W3C WAI, through the Web Content Accessibility Guideline, now it's 2.1, to make sure that websites are accessible and apps are accessible. And thanks to the many big companies like Microsoft, Apple, Google, to include accessibility as a core component of the technology development. So, but technology also threatens a lot of jobs. So it's the same as the blind and the sighted are facing the same challenge, but in different degrees and severity. So the loss of jobs as telephone operators, the loss of jobs in the case of Hong Kong, we practically lost all operator jobs from the government, the traditional switchboard. And now they have to be information service personnel. So that's a new challenge. It's possible, it's just requiring a update in training to coincide with the new job markets. So that's a lesson for the rehabilitation centers for the organizations of the blind and for the blind, that they have to update training very quickly and even ahead. So a kind of R&D work needs to be part of the equation. So, and I believe that in future, that information technology will require more creativity. The work from home culture, the basically the YouTuber culture, the opportunity for self-employment, for discovering one's own skills and selling one's own talents over internet. I think that's something that requires a lot of new training mentality in schools for the blind and other vocational training institutes. So I would like to call upon all of us to address that. So I look forward to the questions time to discuss these issues. And finally, I want to talk about attitudes. Among the obstacles that the survey revealed, people mentioned about attitudes. And surprisingly, for those who are not employed, they didn't mention too much about employers' attitudes. I would have thought that employers' attitude is still the prevailing obstacles. So maybe we need more survey. Maybe we need more different contexts, response from different contexts. While
Minutes, Chanya.
multinational, okay, thank you. While multinational companies are now very popular with diversity and inclusion policies and departments, the attitudes of employers, particularly of supervisors, of co-workers, of peers, is still paramount importance. So I call upon training not just about blind people seeking employment, and it's all about how workplace can be restructured, how inclusive workplace culture can be developed. So this is a thing that, for example, the Dialogue in the Dark in Hong Kong has been developed, a scheme of inclusive workplace as a consultancy to employers, so that they walk the talk, their diversity and inclusion policies is implemented on the ground. So I will stop here. I hope to get more stimulating response from the audience. Thank you very much once again, Karen, for including me.
Thank you, Chanyao. I think you made some very good points. As we heard from all of our panelists, this is a topic that is near and dear to our hearts, moving people with visual impairments into the workplace. I very much appreciated your comments. I'm going to ask Ellen if there are any questions in our chat, because we have a limited amount of time and I don't want to talk if I can listen. Ellen?
Right now we have two, Karen.
Please.
Okay. I think both the attitude and the visually impaired population has changed over the past 25 to 30 years. Having a university diploma is almost obvious, or let's say much more popular than doing some manual craft work. In my experience with a university diploma, it is sometimes more difficult to find a job for a blind youth according to the level of his/her education. And visually impaired children, especially the causes, have altered a lot. This might be the reason in Europe that we do not concentrate so much on training, art, trade, craft competencies among visually impaired children? Is it true in other parts of the world? You're on mute, Karen.
Sorry. Jerry, I
Sorry.
wonder if you would like to start us out and then
Thanks.
I'll chime in.
In general, I think that there is a de-emphasis of manual arts training because people perceive trades, crafts, arts to be minor job opportunities. My perception in the United States is that there are many, many opportunities for skilled people. And it's an academic and rehabilitation counselor and teacher issue, as well as educating families as to the breadth of opportunities that could be available.
Yeah, and I would agree with Jerry. I don't think that we are talking about minimizing academic training. I think that academic training is important, but I think we've lost the focus that we once had on a diverse workplace. And I think that's true both for people with full vision and people with disabilities, visual disabilities. We see an overemphasis in the United States, at least, on academics to the exclusion of all other things. And I think it has been a real issue because many of the young people with whom we work are struggling to find first jobs, many of which require manual skills, not academic credentials. And so while we bemoan the fact that there are not good entry-level jobs, we're not training young people to move into those non-academic jobs, nor are we dealing well, in my estimation, with people who are adventitiously blinded, who were tradespeople or who had skilled jobs and now they don't know quite what to do. And everybody talks to them about going back to school, when the truth of the matter is we might do better to take a closer look at those skills they have retained and help them understand how to modify their techniques using non-visual strategies rather than visual strategies to perform in those jobs.
Karen,
So I
if
don't
might-
think it's an either or. I think it's a blended approach that we need. I'm sorry, Jerry?
Karen, if I might add to that, I've had the privilege of working with 5 different former contractors, building contractors, and just helping them learn non-visual methods of measurement, layout, tool handling, learning to use power tools, saws, drills, drill presses, lathes, woodworking machines. And because I had the privilege of working with these 5 people, 4 of them have gone back into their former trades. There was no training necessarily available to them as they were losing their vision and realizing that they were in jeopardy. And we did have a wood shop at the Enchanted Hills camp of the Lighthouse for the Blind for several years. And we were able to reintroduce these people to their own craft skill set, just modifying their skills so they could do things without their vision.
Yeah, I think it underscores the fact that we need a blended approach. We don't have an either or world that we live in. I think both Jerry and Chun Yao talked about massage therapy, which is another one of those skilled manual skill kinds of trades. Martin talked about the issues with regard to the rural community and the lack of job opportunities. But I would remind everyone the more diversity that we build in, the more adaptable all of our clients, students, and people that we care about are going to be in a labor market that is rapidly changing. So, oh, sorry.
All right.
Yes.
Yes. In this regard, I want to do some advertisements because the Aspiro project is a platform that provides a lot of different cases and stories of diverse employment. And then another one platform, which is good, is Be My Eyes, the apps from Denmark. So you can go there and check with stories about blind people in employment. I have an interview there, so I have a self advertisement. so do go there and listen to, and you'll find that there is really a diverse kind of employment opportunities possible.
Thank you, Chunyao, for that reminder. I particularly want to call people's attention to Project Aspiro. The website is projectaspiro.com, and Chunyao's Be My Eyes interview is linked, so you can kill two birds with one stone. Ellen, do you have another question for us?
Yes,
please?
we do have a couple more. Any indication of percentage of self-employed persons in the study?
I did look at that, but I cannot tell you off the top of my head. I'm sorry about that. If you follow up with an email, I will be able to give you that statistic.
I think, Karen, I remember something like around 5 or 6% in self-employment. And I thought that was remarkably low as well. Here in North America, we tend to not any longer support the exploration and the development of self-employment, which we did a lot more of in the 60s and 70s.
Yeah, I think that it points out what Jerry is saying, points out again the fact that our sample was really rather small, all things considered. And so if we do another survey, which I'm curious to know what people's thoughts are about that, we would want to try to expand it in many ways. As Chunyao mentioned, the language option needs to be considered. And I think probing more directly into self-employment would be a really good approach as well in another survey. So let me quickly turn to Ellen because I want to make sure we get as many of these questions in as possible.
Thank you. This question is for Jerry. Any examples of good skills training program which he could mention?
At this point, I'm reluctant to say because I'm no longer in the primary service delivery model. However, the Lighthouse for the Blind in Seattle, Washington, has over 250 blind visually impaired people and nearly 40 deafblind people employed in a huge variety of manufacturing skills. They do contract work for Boeing aircraft. They do contract work for IBM. They do a lot of machine tool and building activities. And I know that there are other programs like that in the United States, but at this point, I'm not acquainted with them directly.
Thank you, Jerry. I will mention to everyone that the Seattle Lighthouse, which Jerry just mentioned to you, has a link also from Project Aspiro. So if you would like to see some of the activities at the Lighthouse and some, particularly the deaf-blind employees, testimonials, those are all up on Project Aspiro.
Could I just add there, Karen, that just
Please.
in relation to training programs and accessibility, The RNIB website has very useful information that could be used in any country around how to make training accessible. And this can be used with professionals if they're trying to adapt their programs. So the employment pages of the RNIB website can give people information on accessible training programs, if that would be of use.
Thank you so much, Martin, for reminding me. There are some wonderful resources on the RNIB website. rnib.org/UK takes you directly there. And if you punch in employment in that search box, it'll take you to the pages. Thank you. Good reminder. Ellen.
Among your employment statistics, did you register any people that work in a music-related field?
There were musicians in our study, fewer than you might anticipate, but again, I think that we did not reach as many people as we would have really liked to have reached. And but those statistics are all there in the full report, and you are most welcome to a copy of that report. Just let either me or Ellen know. You have our email addresses, and we will get the report out to you. Certainly there were musicians. Anything else, Ellen?
Yes. Did the study seek to investigate how persons obtain their jobs?
We asked some open-ended questions that gave us some indication as to how people acquired their jobs, but it was not as detailed as we may have wanted to do to answer your question. We know that many people were doing jobs that they had evolved into, meaning they had moved up in their organizations or moved around in their organizations, but we did not ask that specific question, like, did you have help from rehab, or did you have help from your family, or did you have, we simply asked open-ended questions, and again, all of that information is in the full report. And you are welcome to probe. If you would like me to drill deeper into the data, I'm happy to do so. If you remind me what it is you are interested in, I can look at those qualitative responses and see what might be of interest to you. Jerry, were you trying to say something?
I was just going to comment that if there's an opportunity to make a recommendation to WBU about further survey, which I certainly encourage, and I think WBU is the appropriate place from which the survey should be initiated. As Chanyao said, multiple languages would be wonderful. I'm thinking that soliciting participation from people from around various countries and various agencies ahead of time to engage in the creation of the survey and the translation of the survey into languages that they serve would be a really big step forward to increase our awareness of what blind people are doing around the world. And then an outcome from that could also be a publication that really focused on, I want to say, like the dictionary of occupational titles for the blind. There was one done by a blind agency in Detroit, Michigan, way back in the 50s. It was called Dictionary of Occupational Titles for the Blind, and they listed nearly 900 jobs that blind visually impaired people were doing throughout the United States at that time. We augmented that from Sensory Access Foundation in 1979, but I have seen very little information along those lines since, and I think that would be broadly useful to all of us in all countries, how people do their jobs, what kind of tool sets they use, what kind of skills they developed to get those jobs.
Thank you, Jerry. I think that might be a wonderful addition to Project Aspiro in the future, and we must think about that moving forward. The The World Blind Union is very supportive of the Employment Resources website, Project Aspiro. And I, like Jerry, used that Dictionary of Occupational Titles for the Blind for many, many years and think it would be wonderful to see it replicated. So thank you for that comment. I appreciate it. Ellen, any further questions or concerns from the audience?
Yes, I have a few more here, if we can try to get through some of them. I'm not going to read this whole comment. She's asking if smartphones are so vital in work life for persons with vision impairment, how can we use that medium more efficiently as education and information tools? From her experience in some of the underdeveloped countries, smartphones are not readily available, but there's more use of the smart version. And she's wondering if that's the same in rural parts of Asia and elsewhere.
Chanyao, would you like to address that, please?
Okay, well, as far as I understand, smartphones are quite widely available in these parts of the world. It actually helps to stimulate some new forms of employment. I have heard blind people being a very popular YouTuber or web host, telling stories, and so on. And then there is, I think that what can be improved is in terms of a more systematic approach in training in schools about the use of smartphones and so on. So this can be a big topic. So I can answer that in Asia, as far as I understand, it's already being used as a very effective tool in employment and education.
Yeah, I think that if the participant who is asking about the inclusion of smartphone training in education would send an email, I think we could follow up with some additional ideas, a bit more extensive, but I think at the moment we better try to catch these other questions as quickly as possible. So thank you very much for the question, and Chanya for your good answer. Ellen?
Good afternoon. I'm from Argentina. I would like to know if there are any experiences of persons with disabilities working in the rural world.
In the rural world?
Rural, R-U-R-A-L, rural.
Oh, that's what you said, okay.
Yes.
I just wanted to be sure I could hear anything at this point.
I know.
We do see some really good work experiences that have been highlighted in the rural communities. I think about one of my favorites, which is the beekeeper in Uganda, who is blind and has been not only keeping his own bees, but has been training other blind and low vision people in his communities and the surrounding communities how to be a bee tender. Many of the rural jobs that I have seen, both in my experience and through the survey, are farming kinds of jobs where people are working with livestock or people are working with production of foodstuffs. And those are well represented in the rural communities. In fact, those are probably more likely to be represented in the rural communities than just any other kinds of jobs, those home-based or self-employment opportunities through farming and livestock management. We also
Karen, equipment repair and maintenance is pretty high here in the Western United States and in the Central United States. Blind people are doing tractor and motor and equipment repair.
Very good point, Jerry. I've also seen some very good entrepreneurial efforts of blind people in rural areas doing things like fixing braille writers, for example, or maintaining braille writers. So I think Jerry's point about the manuals, arts skills is a very important consideration for rural employment. And then the other thing I would mention to you is that this new digital or blended work environment really, I think, offers up some new and good work opportunities to people outside of the urban areas. As Martin mentioned in his comment, the use of technology to work remotely has provided many people with the opportunity to stay in those rural areas rather than move into those more urbanized areas of the various countries. So I remind you.
I would just add to that, Karen, yes, I totally agree. There are many examples of people who were doing a job in a city, in a more urban location. They're now doing the same job where they live, which can very often be a rural environment, but they're doing the same job remotely with some adjustments because of the recent pandemic.
Yeah, I think it's been one of the great positives to come out of the pandemic is that we are seeing employers much more receptive to remote work and much more receptive to blended options where people work remotely, say 3-4 days a week, and go into the office if they need to go in once a week rather than having to be there every day. I think the world is changing and so are employed people changing. But I think it's that combination that the more diversity in skills that we can give people, the more diversity in location that they have. Ellen.
How can we ensure that any future survey is not overloaded by responses from cities?
Oh, I'll answer that one because it's really quite simple. It's about collaboration. It's about collaboration, and it means that those of you who are in organizations, who are working at schools, who are in NGOs, hopefully you can collaborate with us because together I think we can reach people in rural areas. We can reach people who are not internet savvy or don't have good internet connections all the time, but it has to be a collaborative effort. If we decide as an employment committee to move forward with a follow-up survey, I will reach out to the communities that have worked with WBU in the past, NGOs, corporations, agencies, and ask for volunteers to work with me on developing that survey so that we get good representation. I think Jerry kind of hit the nail on the head when he talked about the fact that we really, really need more people involved and more languages. I think that we can use digital devices to our advantage by making absolutely certain that the survey is accessible in a smartphone or mobile device environment. We tried very hard to make that happen this round. I'm just not quite sure that we were diligent enough or lucky enough to hit all of those rural and urban areas. But I think it's about collaboration. Now, I realize we're very, very close to the end. Is there one last question, Ellen, or are we good?
There's one comment. India uses smartphones paired with Bluetooth or OTG connected keyboards for educational purposes for the blind.
Thank you very much. I think that was Shalika who put that
Yes,
in there.
please.
And she's spot on. Absolutely, Shalika. We do see that happening. I see it more and more in rehabilitation too, with the keyboards for entry to the smartphone. So any of those adaptations that you can make and work with young people in the classroom are going to be to their advantage. I want to take just 2 minutes to thank all of you who have participated, who have hung with us through the whole session, and I appreciate your involvement very much. Please do not hesitate to reach out to me or to Ellen if you have follow-up questions you'd like to pose to any of our panelists, and we will forward those on to them. If you would like a copy of the survey, to please let me know, and I will make that available to you. Or Ellen, one of us will get it to you. I thank you very much for your participation. I cannot tell you how much I appreciate the panelists because words fail me at that point. Just, you guys were great. Thank you. And I look forward to following up with you in the very near future. Take good care, everyone, and thank you for your participation.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Take good care.
Webinar is being recorded. Button.